Hey there! Tonight's story isn't about knights or kings, but about the ones history kept at the edge of the page. You'll follow the daily rhythm of a woman in the Middle Ages. Whether born to a cottage or a castle, your path is narrow. Your voice is quiet, and your world is full of expectations, prayers, labour, and rules. Some days pass in silent routine. Others in pain no one writes down. Still you carry on, because that's what's expected. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe. But only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is right now. It's always quietly reassuring to know who else is drifting off to the same story. So, let the candles burn low. Let the chapel bells fade. And step quietly into a world you were never meant to rule, but were expected to endure. It begins, as most things do, in the dark. A stone cottage, a timber-framed hall, a quiet convent cell. The setting shifts depending on one's station, but the experience, coming into the world as a girl in medieval Europe, is surprisingly consistent. It starts with the blood. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was not a dramatic affair in the way Hollywood might have it. There were no galloping horses or shouting men. No, it was an affair of women. A chamber prepared, warmed if it could be, herbs and oils steeped, the midwife summoned, and all men very firmly told to wait outside and try not to faint. In noble households, the birthing chamber might be draped in tapestries and warmed with braziers. In peasant homes, it was whatever space could be cleared beside the hearth, where the light from the fire flickered across the straw-strewn floor. Either way, the atmosphere was hushed, reverent, and tinged with fear. Midwives were essential, both practically and spiritually. Their tools were not surgical, no forceps or sterile instruments, but their knowledge of the female body, passed down through generations, was formidable. They knew when to brew raspberry leaf for labour pains, when to burn bay leaves to mask the smell of blood, when to call for the priest. For it was a dangerous thing, birth. The odds were not in anyone's favour. 1 in 3 women might die from complications of childbirth in her lifetime. The baby, too, was not guaranteed to live. In fact, infant mortality rates were staggering by modern standards. 1 in 4 babies would not survive the first year. The birth of a girl was met with quieter celebration than a boy, particularly among the nobility, where inheritance and lineage were closely guarded. Still, there was hope. Hope that she might live, that she might marry well, that she might one day produce sons. The church taught that pain in childbirth was Eve's fault, of course. A curse upon women for that unfortunate incident with the fruit and the serpent. Women were reminded that suffering was their spiritual inheritance, though they might earn some credit for enduring it with grace. In particularly difficult births, holy relics might be brought in. A scrap of a saint's robe, a sliver of the true cross, a vial of murky water from a well said to cure fevers. And if death seemed near, the midwife might baptize the infant herself. No priest needed in an emergency. Better a heretical baptism than an unbaptized soul. If the child survived, the next step was naming. For a peasant girl, the name might be simple: Alice, Agnes, or Matilda. Names drawn from saints, grandmothers, or whatever the local priest happened to favour. Among the nobility, names carried lineage. a noble daughter might be called Eleanor or Isabel, chosen to recall a mother, an alliance, or an ancestral title. Names in those days were not about individuality, they were about continuity. The baptism followed soon after, often within days, if not hours. The church insisted on it, not for celebration, but for salvation. The baby, swaddled in linen strips, would be carried to the church where the priest would perform the rite. It was believed that unbaptized infants who died would be trapped in limbo, a sorrowful but necessary outcome in the church's view, though many a grieving mother likely felt otherwise. The font was cold, the stone damp with centuries of other tiny heads dipped into it. Godparents were chosen, often more for social obligation than affection. A godparent was not simply a spiritual guide. They might one day serve as legal guardian, should the parents die. After baptism, the mother underwent a rite of her own, churching. This was a purification ceremony performed around 40 days after birth. The woman, having been considered ritually unclean during and after childbirth, would be blessed by the priest and welcomed back into the church. Some women found comfort in it. Others, one suspects, found it quietly insulting. Still, it was custom. A woman's body might bring life into the world, but it had to be washed of its implication first. In terms of practical baby care, medieval approaches were oddly specific. Swaddling was a near universal practice. Babies were tightly bound in strips of cloth to keep their limbs straight, their bodies warm, and supposedly their morals in check. A wriggling infant was seen as disobedient. Better, they thought, to bind them gently, like a little scroll of flesh and linen. Cradles were simple, often wooden, sometimes with rockers. A noblewoman might have a nursemaid to soothe the child through the night. A peasant woman did it herself, usually while also attending to older children, livestock, and the brewing pot. Multitasking, as they say, has ancient roots. Feeding was done by breast if the mother could, or by wet nurse if she couldn't, or if she was noble enough to avoid it. Among the aristocracy, it was fashionable to hire a village woman with robust health to feed one's child. This, they believed, preserved the mother's figure and freed her to resume her social duties. The milk of the wet nurse, it was said, could influence the child's character. So great care was taken in choosing one. No loose morals, no bad temper, no garlic in the diet. Weaning came early, sometimes as young as 6 months. Bread soaked in milk, or paps made of mashed grains, were common. There were no bottles, only spoons and cloths and, at times, pure guesswork. As the infant grew into a small child, the expectations began to crystallize. Girls were taught from the very start that their world was narrower than their brothers. A boy might learn to read, might train to fight, might inherit land. A girl, on the other hand, was trained to wait. She waited to serve, waited to be chosen, waited to become what a family needed. Another marriage tie, another dowry arranged, another womb prepared to carry the next generation. Even the games she played hinted at this future. While boys practiced with sticks and learned to climb, girls mimicked household work, rocking dolls in makeshift cradles, pretending to sweep, weaving grass into ribbons. Among noble families, a girl might be sent to another household as a lady-in-waiting or a foster child, part education, part alliance. Among peasants, she stayed put, learning from her mother how to bake, spin, patch, and pray. The idea of childhood, as we think of it today, did not quite exist. Children were not mini adults exactly, but they were not wrapped in sentimentality either. They were expected to contribute early, to understand roles, to behave. A child that survived beyond 7 years old was considered likely to make it to adulthood, though what that meant, especially for a girl, was a different story. The girl learned to lower her gaze, to keep her voice soft, to kneel properly in church. She learned that her body would not always be her own, though no one would have phrased it like that. She learned to smile at older men who came calling, to pretend she did not notice the way her mother tightened her grip on her shoulder, just so. For the noble girl, luxury was not freedom. Silks and rings came with expectations. Her virginity was a political asset. Her education, if she had one, was tailored. Religious texts, proper handwriting, courtly manners, perhaps some Latin if the abbess was feeling ambitious. For the peasant girl, survival was the lesson. How to stretch a loaf, mend a hem, comfort a baby with a lullaby her own mother had sung. She learned that hands blistered in winter, and that men sometimes came home angry. She learned the language of caution. Both understood silence. It was, after all, the safest vocabulary for a girl. And yet, for all of this, there was joy too. The laughter of siblings, the warmth of a dog curled at one's feet, the smell of bread in the oven and rosemary drying in the beams, the moments between chores where a girl might sing to herself, or imagine something larger somewhere else. In truth, medieval girlhood was not simply grim. It was complex. Like today, it was a place of contradictions, of affection and restraint, of closeness and control. A time when the future hovered just outside the window, barely seen, but very much felt. As dusk falls across the village, one can almost hear them. The girls in woolen smocks, hands tucked into sleeves, whispering secrets in the hayloft. The noble daughters pressing wax seals into practice letters. The daughters of blacksmiths watching the sparks, dreaming of something they can't quite name. Soon they will be told what is expected of them. But for now, the fire crackles, the night deepens, and the world is momentarily quiet. Let them rest. Tomorrow they will learn to be women. In the Middle Ages, girlhood was not a long and whimsical affair. It was brief, practical, and almost always productive. If a girl was lucky enough to survive infancy, and many weren't, she was quickly drawn into the world of work. Girlhood, in medieval terms, was not a protected bubble of learning and laughter. It was apprenticeship for the harder life that lay ahead. Whether born into a mud-walled peasant cottage or a chilly stone manor, a girl's training began early. By the time she could walk steadily and speak in sentences, her hands were already occupied. There were clothes to mend, food to fetch, fires to keep alive, and endless small tasks for her to perform. Rest was a concept reserved for others, and play, if it occurred, often doubled as a lesson. Let us begin, as many days did, with the peasant girl. She awoke early, before the sun in winter, with the first birdsong in summer. Her sleeping spot might be a straw-stuffed sack shared with siblings, or simply a woolen blanket on a bench by the hearth. Her family's house was one room, smoky, close, and never truly silent. The smell of ash, sour ale, and animal fur was everywhere. The day's first job might be gathering kindling from the woodpile, or fetching water from the stream. Jugs were heavy and cold, and feet bare. Her breath puffed into clouds, and her arms ached by the time she returned. She might then help knead the bread dough, coarse and dark, and stir the morning pottage, which had been simmering through the night, never fully finished, always added to. Her fingers grew used to constant motion. She twisted flax into thread with a drop spindle, fed chickens, swept the floor, though the dirt returned almost instantly, and kept a younger sibling distracted while her mother tended to the goat or stirred the brewing pot. It is worth pausing on the topic of spinning. Spinning was so essential to medieval life that it became synonymous with womanhood. The term distaff side, referring to female lineage, comes from the distaff, a tool used in spinning. Girls learned to spin almost as soon as they could hold the spindle steady. It was a meditative motion, pull, twist, wind, and as natural to a young girl's body as breathing. Threads were precious. Wool and linen weren't just clothing, they were status, protection, and work made visible. A girl's earliest education came through observation. She watched her mother's hands, her movements, the quiet signs exchanged between neighbours. She learned when to speak and when to remain still. Her world was filled with women doing things, baking, mending, tending, weaving, and whispering. There was no room for idleness, and very little tolerance for complaint. In slightly wealthier homes, girls might also help with brewing. This was women's work, at least until it became profitable enough for men to take over later in history. A girl learned when to add the hops, how to test the strength, and how to strain the wort. It was both chemistry and economy. Now let us shift to the noble girl. She too rose early, though her chamber was more refined. She awoke on a rope-strung bed, perhaps, under layers of wool and linen, with a servant to light the fire and help her dress. Her garments were finer, chemise, kirtle, and gown, but no less restrictive. The cold seeped through stone walls just the same, no matter how many tapestries tried to warm them. Breakfast might include honeyed bread, watered wine, and preserved fruit. Then came her instruction. A noble girl's education was highly curated. She might learn to read, especially from a psalter or book of hours, but only rarely to write. That was for clerks. Her lessons included embroidery, courtly manners, the lute or harp, and occasionally a bit of Latin. The purpose was not scholarship, it was preparation for marriage, for hospitality, and, if need be, for running a household in her husband's absence. She learned how to walk gracefully, how to curtsy, how to accept a compliment without appearing vain. Everything was measured. Even her laughter was supposed to be moderate. Even joy, it seemed, had its boundaries. Girls of all classes were taught humility, obedience, and faith, though in varying measures and with varying outcomes. Religion loomed large over girlhood. The church set the rhythms of life and determined its meaning. Girls were taught that their place in the world was divinely ordained, lower than men, yet more prone to sin, and therefore in greater need of guidance. The Virgin Mary was the model. Pure, silent, submissive, miraculously maternal. That was the standard. Anything else was suspect. From an early age, girls memorized prayers. They knew when to kneel, how to cross themselves, and how to hold a rosary. Confession came early. They were expected to reveal their thoughts, not just their actions, disobedience, jealousy, vanity. A child who lied about stealing a plum might be told she'd tarnished her soul, which must have been a rather heavy concept for someone still missing her front teeth. There were saints' days to observe, fasts to keep, and processions to join. For some, it was a comfort. For others, it was simply another rule. Either way, religion was woven into the fabric of the day like a silver thread, subtle, unbreakable. Among the lower classes, formal schooling was rare, but learning still occurred. A peasant girl might be taught how to count coins, how to track the phases of the moon, when to plant, when to harvest, and which herbs soothed a baby's cough. Her knowledge was passed down orally, a mix of folk tradition and practical survival. In some towns, girls apprenticed under tradeswomen. They might learn lace-making, midwifery, or textile dyeing. Guilds usually excluded women, but exceptions existed, and widows often continued their husbands' trades. These skills offered a slim form of independence, a way to earn, to negotiate, to survive. The work, of course, was unrelenting. The noble girl learned to manage the kitchen ledger, to supervise servants, to embroider for hours without complaint. She practiced spinning too, more as a virtue than necessity, but her stitches were scrutinized for neatness. She might be called upon to help prepare a feast, to tend a sick relative, or to accompany her mother to a neighbouring estate. Everything she did was training for marriage, for piety, for respectability. And while it's tempting to romanticize her life, the gowns, the jewels, the minstrels, her freedom was heavily curtailed. Her life was monitored, her movements noted, her speech often limited to what was appropriate. Behind the fine curtain, there was little room to breathe. Peasant girls, by contrast, had more physical freedom, but less protection. They worked in fields, helped with animals, gathered firewood and herbs, and were sent to market alone. They were more exposed to danger, but also to the world. A peasant girl might see more of life before age 10 than a noble girl saw before her wedding night. Evenings brought no real rest. Candlelight was expensive and carefully rationed. Girls used the final hour of light to complete their tasks: mending, spinning, folding, cleaning. Then came supper, usually a modest affair. For peasants, it was thick porridge, cabbage, and if lucky, a bit of salted meat. For nobles, it might include roasted game, ale, and preserved fruit. After supper, there might be music, or reading, or stories by the hearth. Girls listened more than they spoke. They learned what to say and what to hide. They learned how quickly reputation could change, and how long shame could linger. And then, sleep. Some girls slept on straw pallets, others on feather mattresses, some with sisters, some with nursemaids, some alone in a convent dormitory. Dreams came, of embroidered saints, of hearth fires, of things they could not name but somehow feared. Still the days had their small pleasures. A stolen plum, a song hummed during work, a ribbon saved from a feast. Girls were not unthinking machines of obedience. They found ways to be themselves within the narrow space allowed. A peasant girl might carve her initials into the beams. A noble girl might compose a verse no one would hear. Small acts of resistance, or simply small claims to identity. Their lives were shaped by duty, but within that they lived, and it's worth remembering that the skills they learned were not without value. A girl who mastered spinning could clothe a family. A girl who knew her herbs could heal. A girl who understood the rhythms of feast and fast, prayer and penance, could hold a household together. These were not ornamental talents. They were survival. So tonight, as the candles gutter and the wind slides against the shutter, picture them. the young girls of the medieval world, hands stained with dye, sleeves damp with washing, hearts full of duty and quiet dreams. They are not idle. They are learning. And tomorrow they will rise again, before the light, before the warmth, before anyone else. Girlhood in the Middle Ages was not a pause before life. It was the first chapter of it. Let them sleep. The spindle awaits. In the medieval world, a girl did not so much become a woman as quietly slip into the role one morning while milking a goat. There was no grand announcement, no candles or cakes or parties to mark the transition. Instead, a subtle shift began. Noticed first in whispers, then glances, and eventually in the extra care taken when she stepped outside. Puberty in the Middle Ages was not celebrated. It was endured. Let us begin, as we often must, with the body. At a certain point, often between the ages of 12 and 14, but sometimes as early as 10, a girl's body began to change. Her hips softened. Her chest began to bud. Her monthly bleeding, known euphemistically as her flowers or curse, arrived without warning and in many cases without explanation. For many, it came as a shock. There were no schoolrooms with labelled diagrams, no gentle pamphlets. If a girl was lucky, her mother or an older sister prepared her. But often, the first bleeding came alone and was met with fear. Blood, after all, was not a casual thing in the Middle Ages. It signalled injury, punishment, or even demonic involvement. The body, it seemed, had betrayed her. And then there was the shame. From the moment her body began to change, so too did the way others looked at her. Before, she might have run barefoot through the courtyard or climbed trees after eggs. After, she was told to lower her eyes, to keep her sleeves long, to walk with care. The world, once practical and straightforward, now contained invisible traps. A flash of ankle. A laugh too loud. A moment alone with a boy, it could all be misinterpreted. The medieval church viewed menstruation as part of the inherited stain of Eve's sin. It was unclean, not metaphorically, but quite literally. Women were advised not to enter sacred spaces during their courses. In some places, they were forbidden from receiving communion or even touching sacred objects. The body, for all its piety and purpose, was suspect. One could be a virgin, a saint, and still be considered impure for bleeding naturally. In practical terms, medieval women managed their menstruation with folded cloth, called wipes or rags, held in place by a linen belt, or tucked tightly beneath layers of wool. There were no disposable products, no washing machines. Water was fetched by hand. Everything had to be scrubbed and dried discreetly. A girl might have only 1 or 2 changes of linen. Privacy was rare. Cleanliness was hard won. Whispers circulated among women about which herbs might slow the bleeding or ease the cramps. Sage, yarrow, mugwort. These were passed down like recipes, woman to woman, rarely written, and always in hushed tones, away from the ears of fathers and brothers. Meanwhile, the wider community had begun to watch her. The term maiden now applied in earnest. It meant she was eligible, though mercifully not always ready, for marriage. Suitors might begin to appear, sent by their mothers or steered by matchmakers. She would be paraded, not literally, but socially, observed at church, praised for her modesty, her needlework, her silence. A girl's reputation became her currency. One misstep, one conversation overheard, one smile held too long, and the rumours could begin. A peasant girl might be called fast. A noble girl might be thought unchaste. Both labels were heavy and difficult to erase. Ironically, she was not supposed to speak of her womanhood, but everyone else could comment on it. For noble girls, these years marked the final stage of training before marriage. Their instruction grew more serious. How to run a household, how to instruct servants, how to bear sons, and, just as importantly, how to hold one's tongue. The art of being pleasant but not too familiar, learned but not arrogant, pious but not sanctimonious. She was taught to bow to her father, and then one day to her husband. For peasant girls, the change was less ceremonious. Her chores remained largely the same, but the social gaze altered. She was now expected to behave like a woman, to be modest, diligent, fertile. In some communities, she might work alongside her father in the fields one day and be betrothed the next. A useful womb, a capable back, a strong arm for kneading, these were considered virtues. And then there were the warnings. Girls were told cautionary tales of young women who walked into the woods and came back shamed, of girls who lingered at the well too long, of boys with clever tongues and wandering hands. No one explained desire, only danger. What the church did explain, at great length, was temptation. Women were described as both weak and dangerously alluring, a paradox that left them blamed whether they yielded or resisted. A man who strayed was led astray. A woman who strayed was a harlot. The Virgin Mother Whore Trinity followed them, always. In the convent, things were slightly different. There, a girl might have some reprieve from the pressure of marriage, but the shame of the body remained. Nuns, too, bled. Nuns, too, were warned against thoughts that might lead to sin. In some records, there are accounts of punishments for impure dreams. The body, even in isolation, refused to behave. Some women embraced religion deeply, finding in it purpose and meaning, but others were placed there by families who had too many daughters and not enough dowries. The convent was a solution, pious, tidy, and cost-effective. Whether it was chosen or not, it became a girl's entire world. Her letters were read, her meals were measured, her silence was noted. There was, of course, a darker side to the watching. For every girl warned to behave, there was a man who was not. The age of consent in medieval Europe varied, but could be as young as 12. Many girls were married off before they understood what marriage entailed. Consent was a legal formality, not a personal reality. Some girls resisted. Some ran away. But most, especially the poor, had few choices. The law was rarely on their side. A nobleman who compromised a peasant girl might pay a fine to her father. A priest caught in scandal might be moved to another parish. A girl who lost her virtue through force or persuasion was often blamed for it. And yet, in the spaces between shame and silence, girls found ways to endure. They whispered in kitchens, traded herbal remedies, joked behind church walls. They found moments of companionship, an older sister, a midwife, a kindly neighbour. They learned to read faces, to stay out of reach, to laugh at the absurdities of modesty enforced by men who observed none themselves. They learned to spot which men were safe, which weren't. Who could be trusted with a confidence, who would spread it like butter on bread, and some of them fought. There are accounts, scattered, rare, but real, of girls refusing arranged marriages, of women demanding justice, of midwives protecting their patients against legal reprisal. These stories did not fill the pages of chronicles, but they lived in the oral traditions, passed down like the recipes and the prayers. Because even as their bodies were treated like burdens, their minds kept working. They noticed everything: how their brothers were treated differently, how their mothers wore their exhaustion like a second gown, how the priest's eyes lingered too long, how the Lord's steward always asked for extra wine when they served at table. And in that noticing, they began to grow into the quiet strength that would carry them through the rest of their lives. Not with defiance, there was little room for that, but with a kind of patient resistance, with wisdom gathered from watching, and with alliances formed in whispered Latin and laced sleeves. So tonight, let us imagine them, not the wide-eyed girls of storybooks, but the keen-eyed, quick-minded, weary-limbed girls of real history, sitting at the hearth, one hand spinning, the other adjusting a woolen wrap, feeling the ache in their backs and the tug in their bellies, watching, always watching, learning how to live in a world that never quite welcomed them, but still needed them all the same. Let them sleep now. There is more to learn tomorrow. In the medieval world, a girl's path to marriage often began long before she could spell the word. Marriage was not so much a milestone of life as it was a transaction, one arranged by others, signed not in ink but in goats, acres, or the promise of future sons. Love, if it entered the picture at all, usually came after the agreement had been sealed, if it came at all. Among the peasantry, betrothals were casual but binding. A village father might say over a jug of ale, "Your Tom will marry my Alice, come harvest." No parchment, no fanfare, just a spoken agreement, witnessed by neighbours who would remember. In the eyes of the church, even this might count as a legitimate contract, provided both parties were of age and consented. In noble circles, things were more elaborate. Families drew up formal contracts, witnessed by clerks, and often sealed with wax. These negotiations could take weeks, months, even years. A lord might promise his daughter to the son of a rival baron to end a feud, or to a distant cousin to keep property within the family. The bride, of course, was rarely consulted. The legal age of consent for marriage was 12 for girls, 14 for boys. Though many married later, especially among peasants, the law permitted it early. Some aristocratic girls were betrothed at 6 or 7 and married by 14. A girl might be handed over just as she began to bleed for the first time. Her mother may or may not have explained what that meant. Her father almost certainly did not. Dowries played a central role in these arrangements. A girl's dowry was her portion of the family's wealth, goods, livestock or land that she brought into the marriage. Among nobles, dowries could be impressive: fortified manors, silver goblets, fine textiles or cash. Peasant dowries were more modest, perhaps a pig, a featherbed, or a spinning wheel. The dowry wasn't a gift. It was the family's bargaining chip. The richer the dowry, the better the match. A girl without a dowry was at a disadvantage. Her parents might offer a cousin to go with her, or a useful cow, or lower their expectations entirely. Once the match was confirmed, the girl's behaviour came under scrutiny. She was now a future wife. She was expected to walk with grace, lower her eyes, and know her place. Her virtue became the concern of the entire community. A girl seen speaking too freely to a boy might find herself whispered about. A laugh at the wrong moment could follow her for years. Noble girls might be sent away to live with their future in-laws, a practice called fostering. There, they would be trained in the habits of their new household, what foods were served, which saints were honoured, which servants to trust, and when to speak, rarely and only when spoken to. This was not an act of affection, it was orientation. And so came the wedding. For peasants, a wedding could be as simple as an exchange of vows outside the church. The priest blessed the union, the couple clasped hands, and the deed was done. There might be bread, cheese, a jug of ale, and some dancing if it wasn't raining. The bride's best gown might be blue, the colour of modesty. Her veil would be homemade. Her shoes, if she had any, patched. For nobles, weddings were grander affairs. Church ceremonies followed by days of feasting. Pigeons roasted with herbs, minstrels playing lutes, guests reciting toasts in Latin. The bride, dressed in imported silk or dyed wool, might barely recognise the man beside her, but she'd been taught to smile and to stay silent. Then came the bedding ceremony, a custom both practical and intrusive. Among common folk, this could be as simple as neighbours waiting outside to ensure the couple retired together. In noble houses, the ceremony might be public. Guests walked the couple to the bedchamber. They might undress the bride, offer ribald jokes, sprinkle holy water on the sheets. Some stayed to witness the start of the consummation, though accounts vary wildly on what was truly observed. The goal was simple: to ensure the marriage was valid. A marriage without consummation could be annulled. A bride's virginity was prized, proof that the child she bore would be legitimate, the bloodline unbroken. Some households hung the bedsheets out the next day, spotted with blood. Not for modesty, but as evidence. Sex within marriage was expected but not explained. Girls were rarely told what would happen. Some had vague warnings. Others knew nothing at all. In noble households, older women might offer advice. Don't flinch, or pray while he finishes. In peasant homes, the advice was more direct. It won't take long. The church viewed sex as both sacred and shameful. Marital relations were permitted, but only for procreation, and preferably without too much enthusiasm. Anything resembling pleasure was eyed with suspicion. A wife was not supposed to refuse her husband. Her body was his right, and yet she could be punished for being too eager. It was a narrow path to walk. Marriage gave a man authority over his wife in both legal and spiritual terms. She owed him obedience, labour, and fidelity. He owed her protection, provision, and if inclined, affection. But enforcement was uneven. A woman who disobeyed might be beaten, lightly the law said. A man who strayed was warned. A woman who strayed was ruined. Divorce was nearly impossible. The church permitted annulment under narrow conditions, if the couple were too closely related, or if the marriage had never been consummated, or if one had taken religious vows. But few women had the knowledge or resources to seek such outcomes. Most simply endured. Still, within the institution, women carved out power. A skilled wife could manage a household, oversee accounts, barter at market, and command servants. Among peasants, she worked beside her husband, planting, harvesting, mending, milking. Among nobles, she managed estates in his absence, which was often. War, politics, or pilgrimage regularly took men away. A clever woman knew how to navigate her husband's moods. A kinder man might listen to her counsel. A harsher one might not. Some marriages grew into partnership. Others remained distant transactions. Widowhood, paradoxically, offered more freedom. A widow could inherit property, run a business, and act independently in court. Many preferred not to remarry. A second marriage risked handing everything back to male control. Some widows lived quietly, managing their affairs. Others thrived, becoming influential landlords, moneylenders, or guild members. Urban women, especially in trades, had more visible roles. A wife might work in a shop, brew ale, make candles, or sew for hire. City statutes sometimes recognized their labor. A few even ran businesses in their own names. But marriage still meant legal dependency. A married woman's identity was absorbed into her husband's. She could not sue or be sued. Her wages were his, and yet women endured. They learned how to stretch flour through Lent, how to hold their tongues at supper, how to navigate market gossip. They knew which priests would listen and which wouldn't. They taught their daughters when to smile, when to run, and what herbs might help with bruises or babies. They whispered behind their hands, laughed at the absurdity of things, and got on with the business of survival. They were not always resigned. Some rebelled. A few fled arranged marriages, married for love, or disguised themselves to escape. Others poisoned cruel husbands with herbs accidentally added to stew. Stories passed quietly among women, of clever wives, sly daughters, and the justice no court would give. Tonight, as the fire crackles low, imagine her, a girl no more than 15, standing in her wedding gown. It scratches at the neck. Her hands are cold. Around her, guests toast, music plays, the priest nods. She glances sideways at the man she's been given to. She barely knows him, but she will soon enough. Let her sleep now. Tomorrow she rises early. There is work to do. After the wedding feast ended, after the bread was eaten, the ale spilled, and the guests had finished their leering songs, came the matter of consummation. The moment where all the whispered promises, the negotiations over goats or manors or parcels of land, the exchanged rings and blessings, finally culminated in the cold and rather awkward reality of two strangers sharing a bed. Sex, for the medieval woman, was rarely her idea. That is not to say all women dreaded the wedding night. Some entered with curiosity, others with quiet resignation, and a few with genuine affection, though this was a luxury. What most women lacked was preparation. Sex was not spoken of openly. Girls received advice in half whispers. Close your eyes. Let him do as he will, or if someone was feeling particularly generous, it'll be over soon. There were no books to consult, no diagrams, no frank talks. The church certainly had opinions, but they concerned sin more than comfort. Sex was meant for procreation, full stop. Enjoyment was, at best, a tolerated accident. At worst, a moral failure. Still, the act was expected. A marriage without consummation was incomplete. If a husband failed in this duty, the marriage could be annulled. If a wife refused her husband regularly, she could be accused of withholding her conjugal debts. A sin apparently on par with theft. And so, the bedchamber became a site of obligation. A woman's body, now legally joined to her husband's, was not entirely her own. She might share a mattress stuffed with straw or down, the smell of stale linen and old ash heavy in the air, the sounds of the feast still drifting through shuttered windows. And beside her, a man, sometimes young and nervous, sometimes old and eager, who believed he had rights to her body. Of course, not every man was cruel. Some were considerate, even gentle, but kindness was not guaranteed, nor was understanding. The emphasis always was on duty. From the Church's perspective, marital sex was only virtuous if it resulted in children. The purpose of intercourse was procreation. Pleasure, particularly on the part of the woman, was suspect. Lust, even within marriage, was frowned upon. One could do the deed, but one mustn't enjoy it too much. Ideally, the couple would approach the act as a task to be completed, like threshing grain or settling accounts. Certain days were off limits. No sex during Lent or Advent. None on feast days or fast days, or the eve of receiving communion. Many couples were told to abstain during menstruation, pregnancy, or nursing, which left, you might notice, very few guiltless windows in which to perform one's conjugal duty. And yet, babies came, often. Childbearing was the defining expectation of marriage. A woman's worth, especially among the nobility, was often tied to her fertility. A wife who produced sons was praised. One who bore only daughters might be pitied. One who bore none at all could be replaced. Infertility was generally blamed on the woman, though medical understanding of the time was, shall we say, imaginative. It was believed that conception required a mixture of bodily humours, balance of temperature, and divine favour. Some theorised that women had seed of their own. Others disagreed. Some believed that the position of the stars at the time of conception influenced the child's health and sex. If a child was born deformed, it was said to be the result of a sinful thought during intercourse. A woman's imagination, they believed, could warp flesh. And so the pressure was relentless. Month after month, a woman waited and hoped. There were herbs believed to increase fertility: fennel, mugwort, rue, taken in teas or stewed with wine. There were prayers to saints: Saint Anne, Saint Margaret, even the Virgin Mary herself. Women lit candles, whispered vows, wore charms tucked in their bodices. When pregnancy did come, it brought its own mixture of relief and dread. Medical care was limited. Most women delivered at home, aided by a midwife, an experienced older woman from the village or town. Male physicians rarely attended births unless something went terribly wrong, and even then they hesitated. Childbirth was women's business. A midwife knew how to position a mother, how to tie the umbilical cord with clean thread, how to whisper prayers between contractions. The birthing room was often a small chamber warmed by a fire, the shutters closed against cold and eyes alike. Aromatic herbs were burned to ward off spirits and foul air. The air was thick with incense, the smell of iron and sweat, and the sound of chanting psalms or the mother's groans. The birthing stool, a sturdy wooden chair with a hole in the centre, was common in wealthier homes. Poor women knelt or squatted. Pain relief was sparse. There were herbal remedies, to be sure, poppy, valerian, or wine steeped with mandrake, but dosage was guesswork, and side effects unpredictable. The Church warned against dulling pain too much. After all, Eve's punishment was to bring forth children in sorrow. To escape that pain was to cheat divine justice. Women prayed to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patroness of childbirth. Her legend included being swallowed by a dragon and emerging from its belly unharmed, an oddly appropriate metaphor. Midwives sometimes placed her relics beneath the beds or recited her name during delivery. If the mother survived, thanks were given. If not, her soul was commended swiftly to heaven. Childbirth was deadly serious. Many women did not survive. Infections, hemorrhaging, breech births, and fever took lives regularly. There were no antiseptics, no blood transfusions, and no knowledge of bacteria. A woman might deliver one healthy child and die with the next, or lose the baby, or deliver a stillborn child, wrapped quickly and buried without naming. If the baby lived, baptism was urgent. Infants were often baptized within days, sometimes hours. The soul, it was believed, could not enter heaven without it. Midwives were sometimes granted permission to baptize in emergencies. A weak or dying child was sprinkled with holy water before anyone even asked its name. For noble women, childbirth was a public concern. The arrival of an heir was cause for ceremony. Witnesses were sometimes summoned to confirm the child's legitimacy. If the husband was away, letters were sent. Gifts arrived, swaddling clothes, amulets, sometimes fine linens embroidered with saints' names. Peasant births were quieter. A neighbour might bring broth, or a bundle of dried lavender, or help with the animals. But work resumed quickly. A peasant woman might be back in the fields within days. There was no maternity leave. There was no nursery. Babies slept in the same bed, fed at the breast, and were slung over a hip as their mothers hauled water or kneaded bread. Nursing was expected. Wet nurses were used by the wealthy or when the mother had died. The church discouraged wet nursing, worrying about moral contamination. One woman's milk influencing another's child. But it persisted nonetheless, especially in courtly households, where noble women were discouraged from nursing lest it interfere with fertility or appearance. And all this sex conception, childbirth, was overseen always by the watchful gaze of the church. The medieval church was not short on opinions. Manuals for confessors listed every possible sexual sin: too frequent, too lustful, on the wrong day, in the wrong position. But they offered little guidance on what was permitted beyond not too much. Desire, especially female desire, was treated with suspicion. A wife who initiated intimacy could be accused of having unseemly boldness. Even joy, if too obvious, might need to be confessed. Yet there was also veneration. The Virgin Mary, meek and mild, was the ideal woman, pure, obedient, nurturing. Her image appeared everywhere, but no one could live up to her example. She gave birth without pain, remained a virgin forever, and never once complained about her husband. Medieval women, one imagines, could only sigh and try their best. And so, the average woman lived between contradictions. Her body was sacred and sinful. Her role was exalted and dismissed. She was essential to the continuation of family, faith, and feudal society, and yet denied authority over her own life. Still, she persisted. She survived endless pregnancies, some joyous, some not. She buried children and bore more. She learned to read her body's signs, to sense when danger was near. She trusted the midwife. She prayed to Saint Margaret. She bit down on rags and counted contractions by candlelight. She nursed children while grinding grain, sang lullabies while mending socks. She knew how to keep a fever down, how to wrap swaddling tight, how to soothe colic with fennel water. She endured her husband's needs when she was tired, and whispered to her sister-in-law when she missed her monthly courses. She wasn't allowed to speak much of these things, but she knew them deeply. So tonight, imagine her, a woman lying in a low bed. Her hands are swollen, the air smells of herbs and wax. Somewhere outside, dogs bark. Her child is beside her, red-faced and hungry. She presses the baby close and hums, softly, a tune her own mother sang. The world is still spinning, still demanding. but for this moment she is still. Let her sleep now. Morning comes early. In the Middle Ages, the workday for a peasant woman began before the sun rose and ended long after it set, if it ended at all. She was not merely a housewife. She was a field hand, a cook, a brewer, a midwife, a weaver, a shepherd, a mother, and occasionally, for good measure, a thatcher of roofs. Her life was defined by tasks, by repetition, and by the steady rhythm of survival. And while history remembers kings and crusaders, coats of arms and coronations, most medieval people were not noble. They were poor. And many of those poor were women, wearing rough-spun wool, bent over work from cradle to grave. Let us begin at dawn. There is no need for an alarm clock. Roosters crow, dogs stir, and the baby wails from the corner of the room. The cottage is dim, the hearth has gone cold overnight, and the thatched roof drips gently in one spot near the door. She rises, barefoot on packed earth, and tends the fire with practiced movements. Ash is pushed aside, kindling coaxed into flame. Smoke curls up into the rafters and out through a hole in the roof. Breakfast is whatever remains from the night before. Porridge, if they're lucky. Bread, if it hasn't gone too stale. A bit of cheese, a dried apple, a sip of ale. Yes, even in the morning. Water, being what it is, uncertain, possibly contaminated, is generally left to animals and sinners. Ale is safer. And besides, she brewed it herself. The children must be dressed, the cow milked, the chickens fed. If there's a pig, it will demand its usual fuss. All of this is done before the work of the day truly begins. The medieval manor economy relied on women's labour. On the lord's domain, his estate, peasants owed days of work in exchange for use of the land. Men might plough, harvest, or mend fences. Women gleaned, weeded, sowed flax, and bundled firewood. They worked in the fields beside their husbands, carrying babies on their backs, or leaving older children to watch the little ones. There were no nurseries. The world was your nursery. Even when not in the fields, a woman's work did not let up. She spun wool into thread, a task so common it became a symbol of womanhood itself. In fact, the word distaff, a spinning tool, was often used to refer to the female side of the family. A distaff family. It was not a compliment, necessarily, just a fact. Spinning was constant. Idle hands were frowned upon. A woman might spin while walking, while minding sheep, or while watching the stew pot. Thread was needed for weaving, for sewing, for mending endless tunics and hose. Clothes did not come from markets, but from her own skill. She carded wool, dyed yarn, repaired worn garments, and occasionally bartered spare cloth for salt or candles. She also brewed. Brewing was women's work. Ale was a staple, not a luxury. Weak ale was consumed daily by all ages, even children. It was called small beer, with just enough alcohol to kill off whatever lurked in the water. Women known as alewives brewed in their homes, using family recipes, selling surplus to neighbours. The work was hot, sticky, and fragrant. Malted barley, boiling water, herbs instead of hops. Some women grew modest businesses this way, hanging ale sticks over their doors to show when the brew was ready. But God help the alewife who overcharged or watered her stock. She might be fined, shamed, or dragged to court. In many towns, ale tasters were appointed to test the strength and price of every batch. A woman's reputation could rise or fall on her brew. On top of all this came food, preparing it, preserving it, growing it. A peasant woman tended a garden with cabbages, leeks, beans and onions. She might grow herbs, sage, parsley, fennel, for flavour, medicine, or luck. She fed the hearth with branches gathered from the woods, stirred pots hung over flame, baked flat loaves on stones, and salted or smoked meat if they ever had enough to save. She knew how to stretch what little they had. Barley gruel with nettles, turnips stewed with bone, pottage, a catch-all term for whatever could be boiled. Fresh fruit was rare and seasonal. Dried beans were soaked overnight. Eggs if the hens were laying. Milk if the cow cooperated. Cheese if you had time to curdle and press. Every scrap was used. Waste was not a concept, because waste was not affordable. Then there were the children, always the children. A medieval woman might bear 6, 8, even 10 over her lifetime. Half of them might not live past infancy. Those who survived were put to work early. By 4 or 5, a child might carry firewood, guard geese, or shoe birds from crops. Girls helped in the home, imitating their mothers with rag dolls and wooden spoons. Boys learned the rhythms of planting and herding. School was rare, letters rarer still. Most children learned by doing. And when the children grew up, they needed to be married off. That required dowries, negotiations, and more worry. A daughter was expected to be modest, hard-working, and marriageable. A son was expected to find land or to trade. A mother's work did not end when her children left. It merely extended outward. A peasant woman might also serve as a midwife. If she had experience, she was called upon by neighbours to assist in births, offering herbal tonics, whispered prayers, and a firm hand. She might learn by watching older women, slowly acquiring knowledge passed down orally, rarely written. She charged little or nothing. It was in many ways a sacred duty. She also nursed the sick, prepared bodies for burial, and helped during times of crisis, fire, famine, plague. She knew which plants could reduce fever, which leaves eased pain, which roots to avoid. She learned what worked through trial, error, and sometimes tragedy. Her days were shaped by seasons. In spring, planting. In summer, tending. In autumn, harvest. Winter brought mending, spinning, and trying to keep the fire lit with damp wood. Festivals punctuated the year. Feast days, saints' days, holy days of obligation. On those days, the work paused, briefly. There might be dancing, music, a bit of meat. Then it was back to the usual. Clothing was plain. A linen shift, covered by a woolen gown. An apron, a kerchief tied around her head. Shoes, if she had them, were leather and often damp. She might own a cloak for warmth. Jewellery, if any, was a wooden cross or a brooch to pin her gown. Her home was a one-room cottage, shared with husband, children, perhaps an elderly parent or two, and an alarming number of mice. The floor was hard-packed earth, the walls wattle and daub. Smoke curled from the hearth and lingered near the ceiling. Bedding was straw stuffed in sacks. Privacy did not exist. Comfort was minimal. And yet she endured. She found laughter in gossip with neighbours, comfort in ritual, pride in her skills. She may have known only a few prayers by heart, but she said them daily, over bread, over babies, over sick goats. She marked time not by hours but by chores. First milking, then breakfast, then the turning of the sun. Women like her kept the world spinning quietly. Their labour was not recorded in ledgers. Their names were often forgotten. But they were the heartbeat of the village. And while noble women are the ones who appear in poems and portraits, it was the peasant woman who lived the truest rhythm of the age. She didn't need to read Latin or play the lute. She needed to know when to harvest onions, how to patch a tunic, how to soothe a crying child while minding the fire. Her knowledge was embodied, instinctual, honed by necessity. There were, of course, moments of joy, a good harvest, a child's safe birth, a festival with dancing and music, a night without rats, laughter around a fire, a husband who sang to her softly when no one was listening, a daughter who spun her first good skein of wool. These small joys mattered because they were real, tangible. Heron. So tonight, imagine her. She lies beside the hearth, the embers glowing faintly red. Her back aches. Her hands are chapped. Her belly is full for once, and she hums softly as the baby stirs. Outside, the wind brushes the thatch. Tomorrow she will wake before dawn. But for now she is still. Let her sleep. She's earned it. While most medieval women moved from childhood to marriage with barely a pause to catch their breath, a select few veered off the expected path entirely. They didn't marry, they didn't raise children, and they didn't boil cabbages while a baby cried at their feet. Instead they slipped behind high stone walls, took vows of chastity, and disappeared, at least from the world's eye. They became nuns. To enter a convent was to enter a world both cloistered and strange, sacred and stifling, quiet yet never truly still, a life of rules, prayers and daily ritual, but also surprisingly often a life of books, learning, and, if one was particularly cunning, the faintest scent of independence. Let's begin with why a girl might end up in a convent. For noble families with too many daughters and not enough dowry silver, the convent was a tidy solution. It preserved the family's wealth and spared them the hassle of finding a husband for every child. One daughter to God, two to marriage, and one, perhaps the least charming, to the nearest priory. Some girls were offered to the church as children, their destinies decided before they could walk. It was not always a punishment. For some girls, especially those with a taste for reading or a dislike of childbirth, convent life was a welcome alternative. In a world where a woman's worth was usually measured in wombs and weaving, the monastery offered a rare escape, a place where a woman could live without being someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's cook, or someone's property. Entrance to a convent involved a ceremony, not unlike marriage. There were veils instead of rings, vows instead of kisses, and instead of a husband, the bride of Christ was now wedded to her faith. Her hair was often shorn, her name changed, and her secular life left behind, at least in theory. But what did her new life look like? Convent routines were governed by the rule, most often the rule of St. Benedict, a document written in the 6th century and embraced with fervour for centuries after. This rulebook dictated nearly every hour of a nun's day. Wake up at midnight for prayers. Rise again before dawn. Chant, read scripture, perform chores. Eat in silence. Pray, work, pray again. There were 7 canonical hours, each marked by prayer. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. Yes, that's more than 7, but the math was medieval. Bells rang, voices murmured, psalms echoed in stone halls. It was not an idle life. But within those prayers and fasts, there was variety. Convents varied widely in their daily experience, depending on wealth, location, and leadership. Some were austere. No meat, no heat, barely a blanket between you and pneumonia. Others were surprisingly well appointed, especially if the abbess came from a wealthy family and managed her estate with shrewdness. Some nuns wore coarse wool and bathed once a season. Others dined on roast fish and soft bread, and might own illustrated manuscripts worth more than a village. Education was one of the great benefits of convent life. While most medieval women remained illiterate, nuns were often taught to read Latin, to copy texts, to illuminate manuscripts. Some composed music, wrote treatises, or compiled histories. A handful became renowned scholars in their time. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, a Benedictine abbess in the 12th century, was a writer, composer, mystic, and medical theorist. She wrote about everything from theology to botany. She claimed visions and corresponded with emperors. She was, in short, not to be trifled with. Her success was rare, but she was not entirely alone. The convent, paradoxically, could be one of the few places where a woman might be taken seriously as an intellectual. Removed from the expectations of wifehood, she could study, write, teach, even lead. An abbess had real power over land, tenants, even priests who entered her domain. She could administer estates, hear confessions, and settle disputes. Her signature carried legal weight. She was, in her own small kingdom, sovereign. But not all convents were scholarly havens. Some were overcrowded, poorly funded, and mismanaged. Some were more prison than sanctuary. Novices were kept on strict schedules, meals were meagre, and discipline was harsh. A nun caught dozing during prayers might be made to kneel on cold stones. One who laughed too much, or heaven forbid, sang the wrong tune, might be sent to a cell to reflect on her sins. Chastity was the cornerstone of convent life. Nuns took vows to renounce all earthly desires. They were brides of Christ after all. But human nature being what it is, and medieval walls being neither soundproof nor insurmountable, lapses occurred. There are records, charming, mortifying records, of nuns bearing children, of monks sneaking into nunneries, of abbesses caught harbouring lovers. One English nunnery was once accused of being a brothel under the guise of religion. It's safe to assume that not all charges were fair, but the persistence of such rumours suggests that even cloistered life was not free from scandal. Still, most nuns lived in earnest faith. They embroidered altar cloths, baked communion bread, tended sick villagers, taught girls to read, and prayed sincerely for the souls of others. Their days were structured, their roles respected, their peace, if they were lucky, protected. Some convents specialised in nursing the sick. These were the forerunners of hospitals, with nuns acting as caregivers, herbalists, and midwives. They learned how to treat fevers, bind wounds, and administer tonics. Their knowledge, passed down woman to woman, was rarely written but deeply rooted. It was not science, not quite, but it was experience. Other nuns became scribes. They copied books by hand, letter by letter, in quiet scriptoria, with windows just large enough to read by, but not so large as to tempt distractions. The work was tedious but sacred. They illustrated manuscripts with delicate vines, gold leaf, and the occasional mischievous rabbit in the margin. If one must spend a life indoors, there were worse ways. But not all cloisters were cut off. Some nunneries stood near towns, and while the nuns were meant to remain enclosed, they often interacted with the community. They might offer charity, run schools, or sell surplus goods. A well-run convent was self-sufficient, growing its own food, raising chickens, even making wine. Still, the rule of enclosure loomed large. contact with the outside world was restricted. Visits from male relatives were limited. Letters were censored. Leaving the convent was nearly impossible without special dispensation. The walls were symbolic and real. A shield, a barrier, a line drawn between sacred and profane. And yet, nuns found ways to express themselves. They composed hymns, wrote poetry, embroidered their thoughts into altar cloths. They carved their names into wooden pews. They dreamed of heaven, of escape, of maybe just a little warmth on a winter morning. Some found contentment, others did not. There are stories of nuns who rebelled, who smuggled in trinkets, who staged hunger strikes, who ran away under cover of night. One 14th century English nun, tired of her cloister's strictness, climbed the walls and refused to return. She was excommunicated, then forgiven, then left again. You have to admire her persistence. And then there were those who had no choice. Some girls were dedicated to the church as children, oblates, sent at the age of 5 or 6 to live among nuns and be raised within the faith. They were, in effect, given away. Others were illegitimate daughters, surplus sisters, or inconvenient widows. For these women, the convent was not a calling, but a conclusion. Some made peace. Others never did. In the end, the convent was a paradox. It was a place of restriction and a place of possibility. A world that silenced women, and yet sometimes gave them a voice. A life that denied worldly pleasures, yet offered intellectual freedom. For many, it was the only place they could truly belong. So tonight, picture her. A woman in a stone chamber, kneeling before a wooden cross. The candle beside her flickers low. Her hands are calloused from work. Her back stiff from prayer. But her eyes are steady. She has not spoken aloud in hours, but she has thought deeply about things no one else may ever ask her to share. Outside, the wind moves the branches. Inside, the bell for Compline tolls. Let her rest now. She will rise before dawn. The laws of the Middle Ages, scribbled by scribes and pronounced from high-backed chairs, were intended to preserve order, but mostly the kind of order that benefited men. They were not imagined with women's needs at the centre. Women were often treated more as legal appendages than full participants in justice. Still, that did not mean they were absent from the system. Far from it. They appeared in courtrooms, in village hearings, and before bishops and bailiffs. But how they were seen, and how they were judged, was shaped by the fabric of gender, class, and culture. A medieval woman's legal identity was never truly her own, not unless she was a widow, and even then it was provisional. Before marriage, she was the legal responsibility of her father. Once married, her rights were merged with her husband's under the principle of coverture. A married woman couldn't own property independently, make contracts, or represent herself in court without permission. She was, in law, a covered person, hidden beneath her husband's name, his authority, and often his temper. Unless, of course, something went wrong. Let us begin with property. At the lower levels of society, peasants had modest holdings, cottage plots, vegetable gardens, or perhaps a shared patch of woodland. When a peasant man died, his widow might be granted her dower, a fraction of the land to live on for the rest of her life. But this was always conditional. If she remarried without permission from the local lord, she might lose the right. If her sons came of age and wanted the land back, she might be quietly nudged aside. In towns, Where women sometimes ran alehouses, kept shops, or worked in trades, their ability to own or inherit depended on local custom. Some cities recognised widows as legal individuals, able to sue, lend money, and pay taxes. In places like York or Ghent, a widow might continue her late husband's business with considerable autonomy, but always her legitimacy was borrowed from the memory of her husband, from the goodwill of her neighbours, from the law's temporary indulgence. Noble women had more visible property, but no more control. Land passed through male lines. A woman could inherit, but her husband would manage it. If she were a widow, she might oversee estates, collect rents, and even direct justice in her manor courts. But such power was the exception, not the rule, and she was often advised, if not pressured, to remarry. A woman alone was a problem to be solved. And then there was marriage itself. The church insisted on consent. A valid marriage required that both bride and groom agree freely. But this lofty ideal often clashed with practice. Marriages were arranged, sometimes when the girl was still a child. Fathers bargained dowries. Lords forced matches for political advantage. Girls might find themselves married before their 12th birthday, though consummation was ideally delayed until 14. Once married, a woman's legal status disappeared into her husband's. She could not initiate a lawsuit. She could not control her own earnings. In many ways, she became a legal shadow. The law presumed her obedience and presumed her silence, unless, again, something went wrong. If a woman was mistreated, beaten, abandoned, or cheated, her options were narrow. She could appeal to the church courts, which governed marriage and moral behaviour. A woman deserted by her husband might petition for restitution. A woman whose husband was impotent could, with great embarrassment, seek annulment, though this often involved proving the case through invasive examinations or awkward demonstrations. Divorce, as we know it, did not exist. The church forbade the dissolution of valid marriages. Annulments were permitted only if the marriage had been invalid from the start. Too young, too closely related, forced, or unconsummated. Otherwise, the best a woman could hope for was legal separation, a declaration that she and her husband should live apart. But she would remain married in the eyes of God and the law. As for punishment, the courts were inventive. Minor offences brought fines, especially in manor courts where money was the most efficient form of correction. A woman who brewed poor ale might be fined or banned from selling for a season. A woman who let her geese stray into the Lord's fields might pay a few pence. A woman who shouted at her neighbour, or accused her of stealing, or hexing her butter, might be labelled a scold. The crime of being a common scold was uniquely feminine. It applied only to women and was defined not by specific acts, but by behaviour deemed disruptive: gossiping, quarrelling, speaking too boldly. In England, a scold might be punished by ducking, tied to a chair and submerged in water, sometimes repeatedly, for the community's amusement. In other places, she might be made to wear the scold's bridle, a metal muzzle with a tongue plate that prevented speech. It was as humiliating as it was painful. Women also faced charges of theft, assault, and even murder. They were tried in royal courts, alongside men, and could face hanging if convicted. But their path to conviction, or acquittal, was often shaped by perceptions of character. A woman who was known as pious, quiet, and obedient might receive leniency. One who was seen as loud, proud, or overly clever might not. And then there was the matter of the church courts, the spiritual arm of medieval justice. The ecclesiastical courts claimed authority over all matters of morality: marriage, adultery, fornication, slander, and heresy. Here, women were often brought to answer for their private lives. A woman accused of bearing an illegitimate child might be ordered to confess publicly, to perform penance, or to stand before the congregation in her shift. A woman who slandered another might be forced to swear she would never speak the name again, or else pay a fine in candles. These courts were more focused on saving souls than punishing bodies, but their judgments could still sting. Public penance was humiliating. Community knowledge of a woman's supposed sins could damage her for life. And once branded, she might find herself accused again and again. Witchcraft deserves its own mention. In the earlier Middle Ages, accusations of witchcraft were rare and often dismissed as folk superstition. But as the centuries passed, the concept evolved. By the 14th century, the church began to associate magic with heresy, and heresy with women. A healer who used herbs, a midwife whose patient died, a widow who argued too often. All were at risk. Accusations might begin with whispers: a cow that stopped giving milk, a child who took ill, a curse muttered in anger. Once suspicion took root, it grew like ivy. Trials for witchcraft were unevenly distributed across Europe. In some regions they were common, in others rare. Torture was often used to extract confessions, though it was not universally permitted. A woman accused of consorting with the devil might be examined for witches' marks, pricked with needles, or simply interrogated until exhaustion or desperation produced a plea. And yet, women were not merely victims of justice. They also participated in it. They brought suits to court over broken promises, unpaid debts, stolen livestock. They appeared as witnesses, especially in cases involving neighbours, property, or marriage. In village life, memory was the currency of law. Who saw the fence moved? Who heard the promise made? Who knew the shape of the disputed boundary? Women, often being the ones who stayed home and watched everything, were repositories of this knowledge. Widows especially were active legal agents. No longer under a husband's shadow, they could own land, run businesses, and represent themselves. Some became formidable figures: landladies, moneylenders, even constables in rare cases. Their authority came not just from legal standing, but from reputation. A widow with a sharp tongue and a good memory was not to be underestimated. In urban centres, women participated in guilds, especially as widows continuing a husband's trade. They brewed, baked, wove, stitched, and sold. Some guilds allowed women to be full members. Others tolerated them unofficially. All expected them to obey guild rules, pay dues, and face penalties for transgressions. Justice, as experienced by medieval women, was inconsistent. It depended on class, location, who you knew, and what you were accused of. But beneath the patchwork of law codes and court roles, a pattern emerges. Women learned how to work the system, or at least how to survive it. They played roles when needed. They cried in court. They feigned ignorance. They leaned on memory. They rallied neighbours. They carried their husbands' names like armour. Some fought, some yielded, some just kept showing up. So tonight, picture her. A woman standing on packed earth in a crowded village court. Her shoes are muddy. Her hands are calloused. The bailiff reads the charge. She listens. She speaks clearly, not loudly but firmly. Her neighbours nod. The steward frowns. She has no advocate but herself. Justice may not come swiftly. It may not come at all. But she does not flinch. Let her speak. Let her wait. Let her be heard. Not all women in the Middle Ages toiled in the fields or hauled water from wells. Some were wrapped in silk instead of wool, seated on cushions rather than stools. But being noble did not mean being free. Power for women at the top was ornamental, conditional, and often illusory. For every queen with a sceptre, there were 10 duchesses with nothing but embroidery hoops. And yet, within the great stone halls of medieval power, women of status carved out influence in quieter, subtler ways, through kinship, diplomacy, and the careful art of survival. Let us begin at the apex, queenship. A queen consort, married to a king, had a role both ceremonial and symbolic. She was crowned, anointed, and robed in finery. She processed beside the king at feasts, was prayed for in mass, and received foreign dignitaries with the appropriate blend of grace and silence. Her primary duty, however, was simple: to produce heirs, preferably male, preferably healthy, and preferably without scandal. A queen who failed in this regard might find herself cast aside, blamed for miscarriages or stillbirths, as if her womb were a royal chamber failing to open. In reality, fertility issues were often the result of disease, malnutrition, or sheer bad luck. But these explanations rarely satisfied anxious kings or meddling courtiers. Yet, if a queen bore sons, and did so without excessive drama, she might gain genuine influence. Queens acted as intercessors. Petitioners who dared not approach the king might ask the queen to plead their case. In times of war or absence, some queens served as regents, ruling on behalf of their husbands or sons. Blanche of Castile governed France for nearly a decade, while her son Louis IX came of age. Margaret of Anjou, wife to the mentally ill Henry VI, became a military leader of sorts during the Wars of the Roses. Still, these were exceptions. Most queens lived behind veils, literally and politically. They were expected to be modest, devout, fertile, and loyal. Their education was shaped accordingly. They were taught how to read prayers, manage household accounts, and speak with quiet dignity. Occasionally, they were also taught Latin, music, or classical literature, but always under the assumption that cleverness should be wielded with caution. The day-to-day life of a queen could be stiflingly dull. A great lady might pass hours at her embroidery frame, surrounded by other women of rank, sewing, reading aloud, composing prayers, or waiting for news. She might be accompanied everywhere by a retinue of attendants, ladies in waiting, confessors, chaplains, and chamberers. Privacy was rare, movement was regulated. Even in her own bedchamber, a queen was never quite alone. And yet, even within these confines, queens found ways to shape their world, through marriages arranged for their children, through patronage, supporting monasteries, commissioning churches, founding hospitals. Some even became literary figures in their own right. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, patronized poets and troubadours, and was herself the subject of romantic tales, despite being one of the most politically active women of her era. Moving slightly down the ladder of rank, we find the noblewoman, a baroness, a countess, a lady of a manor. Her responsibilities were not merely decorative. She oversaw vast households, managed estates, resolved tenant disputes, and ensured the smooth operation of everything from grain stores to laundry services. When her husband was away, fighting, hunting, negotiating, she took command. Letters from noble women often contain instructions for planting crops, paying servants, and securing provisions. One 13th century English lady, Margaret de Lacy, corresponded regularly with monks, abbots, and estate stewards, giving orders and settling land issues in her husband's absence. She may not have worn a sword, but she wielded a seal with confidence. These women were often well educated, at least by the standards of the time. Many could read Latin or French. They read psalters, saints' lives, romances, and the occasional work of philosophy. Some, like Christine de Pizan, wrote their own. Christine's book of the City of Ladies was a rare and radical defence of women's worth, penned by a widow who supported herself as a writer at the French court. But even learned ladies were expected to perform femininity to perfection. Beauty was political. A pale complexion suggested nobility and leisure. Tanned skin suggested outdoor labour and thus low birth. Hair was to be long but hidden. Eyes were to be downcast. Laughter was to be controlled. A noble woman's body was not entirely her own. It was a vessel for alliances, a visual symbol of her family's status, a thing to be dressed, watched, and above all married off. Marriage among the nobility was never about love. It was about land, titles, and political advantage. A girl might be promised in marriage before she could walk, and wedded before she could reason. She would be taught to obey, to honour, and to endure. Love, if it came at all, was a happy accident. That said, not all noblewomen were docile. Some manoeuvred with astonishing skill. They wrote to the Pope, appealed to Parliament, bribed bishops, or hired private armies. Matilda of Tuscany fought on behalf of the Pope during the investiture controversy. Isabella of France overthrew her own husband, Edward II, with the help of her lover and a fleet of mercenaries. Even cloistered women could exert authority. Hildegard of Bingen wrote letters to emperors and theologians, warning them of divine wrath with the calm assurance of one who was used to being heeded. Many noble women acted as patrons of the arts. They sponsored manuscripts, commissioned altarpieces, and provided protection for poets and scholars. A book given as a gift by a lady to her husband might contain illustrations of her family's heraldry, subtle reminders of the alliances she brought with her. Her name might be inscribed in a prayer book, not just as a supplicant, but as the patron who had it made. Clothing, too, was a form of statement. Silks from the east, fur from the north, embroidery done with gold thread. A noble woman might wear a gown with a train several feet long, simply to display that she did not need to walk quickly, or much at all. Her sleeves might trail the floor. Her head might be crowned with a hennin, a conical hat so tall it risked brushing the rafters. Fashion was not practical. It was political. It said, "I am rich enough to waste fabric, time, and movement." Court life for these women was a mixture of performance and peril. Ladies attended feasts, dances, and tournaments. They watched knights fight in their honour. They received gifts, jewels, songbooks, love poems, sometimes sincere, sometimes strategic. Romance at court was encouraged in theory, but any hint of impropriety could end a woman's prospects, or her life. Adultery among noblewomen was treated as treason, especially if it risked uncertain parentage. Accusations flew freely, especially during succession crises. A queen might find herself accused of poisoning or sorcery. A lady-in-waiting might be banished for one ill-timed glance. Reputation was everything. it was also fragile. Still, not all was grim. For some noble women, the court was a playground of ideas. Here they could hear music, learn languages, practice diplomacy. They might help arrange treaties or oversee correspondence. Some even went on pilgrimage or crusade, leaving behind detailed letters that tell us more about their lives than any law book ever could. A few became queens in their own right, ruling not as consorts, but as sovereigns. Empress Matilda of England was one such figure, though her claim sparked civil war. Eleanor of Aquitaine held lands in her own name and ruled over them with ferocity. These women, though exceptional, remind us that status could be a sword as well as a shield. But most noble women did not become queens. Most did not lead armies or pen manifestos. They lived more quietly in manors, castles, or courtly apartments. They bore children, wrote letters, ordered fabrics, and tried not to be noticed by the wrong people. Their lives were structured by expectation, shaped by marriage, hemmed in by reputation. And yet, they endured. So tonight, imagine her, not a queen, not a peasant, but a lady of moderate rank. She stands in her solar, the fire crackling low. She has just written a letter to her steward about grain stores. Her gown is tight-laced. Her sleeves are heavy with embroidery. Outside, the wind blows over the thatched roofs of her tenants' homes. She listens, waits, and signs her name with care. Power may not be hers by right, but she holds it gently in her own quiet way. In the end, what remained of a medieval woman was often very little. A name in a marriage register, a painted face in a manuscript margin, a handful of bones in an unmarked grave. History, much like the chroniclers who shaped it, did not lean kindly toward women. Queens were remembered for their wombs. Peasant women disappeared without a whisper. And the rest? They lingered as ghosts in footnotes, patron saints of causes they did not choose, or nameless mothers in family trees that bent ever toward the male line. But they were not entirely lost. In the quiet corners of archives and the marginalia of manuscripts, the echoes of medieval women persist. They survive in court records and tax rolls, in miracle tales and tomb effigies, in songs sung under breath while spinning flax. Their legacy is not always grand, but it is textured, persistent, and strangely human. Let us begin with the most visible, the queens and saints. Queens, when remembered, were remembered selectively. A queen who was obedient and fertile, who gave the king heirs and stayed out of politics, might be praised as a paragon of virtue. Blanche of Castile was memorialized as the pious mother of St. Louis, a woman of great dignity who taught her son to fear sin more than death. She ruled as regent, but even then, her memory was filtered through her role as a mother. On the other hand, powerful queens with opinions, those who wielded real political influence, were often viewed with suspicion. Isabella of France, who deposed her husband Edward II, was branded the she-wolf of France. Empress Matilda, who dared to claim the English throne in her own right, was remembered not as a monarch, but as a woman who overreached. Ambition in a woman, even when cloaked in velvet and sanctioned by lineage, was rarely forgiven. Then there were the saints, women who died young, or painfully, or both. Virgin martyrs like Catherine and Cecilia, who refused pagan husbands and were punished for their virtue. They were venerated, prayed to, painted in chapel frescoes. Their stories were rewritten again and again, usually by monks who had never met a woman like them, and wouldn't have known what to say if they had. Yet these saints offered women models of piety and endurance. Hildegard of Bingen, though not canonised until modern times, was revered in her lifetime for her visions and writings. Clare of Assisi became a spiritual sister to Francis and a founder in her own right. Their voices, preserved in letters and music, suggest lives of intellect and agency, not just submission. Moving downward in rank, the memory of noblewomen survived in ledgers, letters, and, most strikingly, tombs. Effigies carved in stone rest above many a church floor. Women with folded hands, long gowns, hair tucked into linen veils. Some lie beside their husbands, others alone. Their inscriptions speak of grace, honour, and generosity, words chosen by others, rarely by themselves. These memorials tell us more than they seem to. The style of clothing, the placement of hands, the heraldry on a shield, all offer clues to how the woman lived and how her family wished her to be seen. Some tombs were lavish, paid for by sons or husbands eager to show piety. Others are modest, perhaps the best that could be afforded. A few are worn smooth by time and feet, names erased by centuries of churchgoers walking above. There were also women who left behind written records, though not always intentionally. Court transcripts include their words, preserved by clerks with ink-stained fingers. In these lines, women speak plainly about land disputes, broken promises, or chickens gone missing. Their voices are legal, domestic, weary, precise. They were not trying to be remembered. They were trying to be heard. Some women wrote deliberately. Christine de Pizan composed entire books defending the value of women's lives. Her Book of the City of Ladies created an allegorical city where women were safe from slander and celebrated for wisdom. She cited historical women, biblical women, legendary women, and in doing so etched herself into history as one of the first professional female writers in Europe. A few noblewomen kept household accounts or prayer books, now preserved in museums. The margins contain tiny notes, gifts given, letters sent, prayers for departed children. These are not histories in the grand sense, but they are intimate, tactile records of living. They remind us that women remembered themselves even when others did not. And what of the peasant women? The alewives and spinsters, the mothers who buried children before their first winter, the girls who never made it to marriage. These women rarely left written records. Their memories survive in folklore, superstition, and the cautious documentation of others. Sometimes their names appear in tax lists. Marjorie who owes 6p for her goat. Sometimes in court rolls. Agnes who accused her neighbour of theft. These traces are fragmentary. A single name, a brief incident, and then silence. But from these fragments, patterns emerge, of resilience, of labour, of humour tucked into hard lives. Peasant women were remembered locally, if not nationally. They lived in community memory. The old woman who knew herbs, the midwife who never lost a mother, the widow who told stories by the fire. Their reputations were their legacies. Some were feared, accused of witchcraft or bad luck. Others were cherished, mourned when they passed, their names kept alive in song or whispered tales. Wives were remembered by their husbands, sometimes. In the wills of tradesmen and merchants, one finds phrases like, "To my dear wife Joan, I leave our bed and my best cloak," or to Alice, who has kept my house these 30 years. These are not sonnets, but they are markers of companionship, partnership and survival through seasons good and bad. Mothers, too, left impressions on their children, even if unnamed. A knight might remember the prayers his mother taught him. A merchant might recall the meals his mother prepared. Daughters passed on recipes, superstitions, lullabies. Memory was matrilineal, even when lineage was not. Then there are the nameless women in art. Medieval manuscripts teem with images of women, some symbolic, some specific. They are queens and saints, yes, but also shepherdesses, washerwomen, dancers, and demons with curling hair. Sometimes the illustrations seem playful. A woman chasing a rabbit with a spoon, a nun playing a harp. Sometimes they seem sharp. A scold being dunked in a pond. A woman locked in a tower. These images reflect how women were seen, feared, desired, or mocked. But they also reflect the artist's world, where women were part of every street, every home, every chapel. They were not invisible. They were simply overlooked by those who thought history should be written by men, for men, about men. But women remembered each other. Nuns prayed for their sisters long after death. Mothers told stories of grandmothers who baked certain breads or planted garlic by moonlight. Village girls repeated songs sung by older women who, in turn, had learned them decades before. This was oral legacy. It did not make it into books, but it shaped the rhythms of life. Even today, archaeologists uncover clues. A spindle whirl in a ditch, a comb beneath a hearthstone, a silver brooch beside a skeleton with worn teeth and strong hips. The objects women left behind speak when no one else did. They tell of labour, of love, of selfhood expressed through small persistent acts. And finally, some women were remembered not because of who they were, but because of what others made of them. Medieval poets crafted romantic tales of tragic ladies, lovers who died waiting, heroines who wasted away. These were idealized, often fictional, but they shaped how women were imagined for centuries. The lady in the tower, the damsel in distress, the noble woman who died of grief. They were beautiful ghosts. They bore little resemblance to the flesh and blood women who birthed children, made cheese, argued with stewards, and sang while spinning. But their presence in literature ensured that women remained part of cultural memory, even if distorted. So what was the legacy of the medieval woman? It was not written on banners or etched in marble, not often. It was quieter than that. It was the patch sewn into a son's tunic. The yeast passed from mother to daughter. The wound stitched, the field managed, the lawsuit filed, the psalm whispered, the song remembered. Tonight, as the candle burns low, picture her. Any of them, all of them. A queen lighting a votive, a widow writing a letter, a girl carrying water past a blooming hawthorn tree. They did not expect monuments, but they endured. And sometimes enduring is legacy enough. Imagine a land of sun-drenched stone and shimmering river reeds, where the great Nile slices through the desert like a living god, where gold glints beneath linen veils and the scent of blue lotus drifts through towering palace halls. You are in ancient Egypt, not as a faceless peasant, nor even as one of the ever-bickering scribes. Number today, your fate is sealed with coal-lined eyes and a crown of lapis lazuli. You are to become great royal wife, Queen of Egypt, consort to the living god upon the throne. It is, as they say, an honour. Though whether you will still feel so honoured by the end of your days is another matter entirely. From the moment the high priest's messenger arrived at your family villa with trembling voice and sealed papyrus scroll. Your life has been spinning faster than the potter's wheel. Your father, a nobleman of the court, one of the few who might have hoped for such a match, nearly choked on his pomegranate wine. Your mother wept tears that seemed part pride, part dread. You yourself? You smiled, because that is what one does. Inside, a strange knot began to twist beneath your ribs, a knot that even the finest perfumed oils cannot soothe. And so here you are, carried aloft upon a gilded litter borne by 6 of the Pharaoh's finest soldiers, your linen robes trailing like a river of light behind you. The streets of Thebes swarm with onlookers, their voices rising in a wave of acclamation. Or is it curiosity? They shout your name, though many do not know your face. They know only that today a new queen will be crowned. And perhaps, privately, they know too that such queens do not always remain queens for long. The great temple of Karnak looms ahead, colossal columns thick as cedar trunks, each etched with the exploits of kings long dust. The air hums with incense and anticipation. As your litter is lowered before the towering gates, you feel the first flutter of real fear. Once you pass through, there is no turning back. You are met by the high priest, an ancient figure so gaunt he seems to have been carved by the same artisans who built these walls. His smile is thin as papyrus. "Come, daughter of Egypt," he intones, voice echoing through the stone. It is time. You follow him beneath the massive lintels, feet bare upon cool alabaster tiles. Ahead, the inner sanctuary shimmers with lamplight. Statues of Isis and Hathor gaze down upon you, serene and pitiless. Here, the rites of queenship will bind you to the throne, and to all that comes with it. The coronation ritual is long, deliberate, and thick with meaning. You are washed in sacred water, drawn from the Nile at dawn. You are anointed with oils, whose recipes are known only to the temple's innermost circle, oils meant to confer not just physical beauty, but spiritual protection. Your eyelids are darkened with kohl to ward off the evil eye. Your lips stained with red ochre, symbol of life. You are clad in robes of finest linen, embroidered with the royal uraeus, the rearing cobra that marks divine authority. It is a serpent that offers no comfort. And then, the moment, the great crown of the queen is brought forth, gleaming with gold and semi-precious stones. The high priest lifts it high above your bowed head, his voice solemn as he declares you great royal wife of the 2 lands. The crown settles upon your brow with surprising weight. You resist the urge to shift beneath it. At that moment, the doors to the sanctuary swing wide. A trumpet sounds. You emerge once more into the blinding sun, the air thick with cheering and flower petals. But though you smile and wave as trained, already your mind is elsewhere. You know the stories. Every girl at court whispers them beneath embroidered fans. How queens have risen to command armies, to guide kings, even to rule in their own right. And how they have been poisoned, betrayed, erased from memory as though they had never been. There was Nefertari, beloved of Ramses the Great, whose face still gazes serene from her tomb, yet whose life was marked by bitter rivalry within the palace. There was Nefertiti, queen beside the heretic king Akhenaten, whose very fate remains an enigma. Some say she ruled after him, others that she was cast aside. And there was the formidable Hatshepsut, who seized the throne itself, and whose stepson later chiselled her name from monuments in furious retribution. Such is the double-edged sword of queenship in Egypt. For all the silks and perfumes, the days spent drifting through shaded colonnades or presiding over temple rites, the queen walks a knife's edge, too visible, and she courts jealousy. Too passive, and she invites replacement. Producing an heir may secure her place, or simply paint a target upon her back. And the harem? Ah, the harem. You have not yet set foot within it, but already you know its whispered reputation. A gilded prison where royal wives and concubines jostle for influence, their children pawns in a game older than the pyramids. There, poison is a language as fluent as gossip. Favours are won not with smiles, but with alliances. The queen reigns supreme, or so it seems, until the day she does not. Yet for now, outwardly at least, the world is yours. You are presented to the court in a grand ceremony within the palace's pillared audience hall. The pharaoh himself, a living god in gold and lapis, eyes outlined in kohl, takes your hand before the assembled nobles. His grip is warm, firm, his smile unreadable. Together you stand before the throne of Horus. Together you receive the acclamation of the court. Yet beneath the ceremony's splendour lies another truth. From this day forth, your life is no longer your own. Your days will begin with ritual ablutions, washed in Nile water and anointed anew. You will preside over festivals and offerings, your image paraded before the people as living embodiment of Isis. You will dine in halls of gilded reliefs, where servants move in silence and every glance is weighed for hidden meaning. You will attend councils, your voice measured carefully, too forceful, and you risk seeming grasping, too meek, and you invite dismissal. At night, within your private chambers, you may gaze upon the moonlit courtyards and wonder how many of your predecessors once stood in this very place, dreaming of freedom. The servants who dress your hair and pour your wine know better than to speak of such things. But in their eyes, perhaps, you catch a flicker of understanding. And then there is the matter of an heir. For all a queen's titles and honours, this is the role upon which her true power rests. A male child secures the dynasty, cements your place beside the king. Yet childbirth is perilous. Many a royal wife has gone to the tomb in pursuit of this duty. Amulets will be placed beneath your mattress, spells whispered over your swelling belly. Physicians will hover, their remedies a curious blend of wisdom and superstition. Should the child be a girl, well, you will try again. And should you bear a boy, rejoicing, yes, and a subtle sharpening of daggers among the court's rival factions. The life of a queen is not a fairy tale of happy endings. It is a tale of survival, of playing the long game beneath a veneer of divine favour. For every Hatshepsut who rose to rule, there were 10 whose names are lost, their sarcophagi empty, their portraits defaced. But there is power too. With patience, wit, and a keen sense of timing, a queen may shape the destiny of Egypt from behind the throne. She may command armies through her son, sway the priesthood, forge alliances that outlive her rivals. The wise queens do not reach for power too soon, nor wait too long. And so, as the sun sets upon this day of days, you sit within the palace's perfumed inner chambers, your crown newly polished, your fingers stained faintly with henna. The court musicians play softly beyond the screened doorway. The king dines elsewhere tonight, no doubt consulting with his viziers or inspecting temple plans. You sip date wine from a chalice shaped like a lotus. Sweet, yes, but laced with the bittersweet taste of all that lies ahead. You are great royal wife of Egypt, adored, envied, watched from all sides. Behind the silks and gold lies a simple truth. Here, power and peril are one and the same. Sleep well, Queen, while you still can. Morning comes not with a gentle nudge, but with the deliberate chime of bronze bells in the dark. You are awake before the first blush of sun gilds the horizon, before even the acolytes have swept the sand from the temple courtyards. The Queen must be seen, polished, radiant, otherworldly, before the realm itself stirs. In the stillness of your private chambers, carved cedar screens filter the early light. The air is cool and sweet with lotus and frankincense, for servants have spent the better part of the night burning cones of resin to ensure that no foul spirit lingers come dawn. One can never be too careful, especially when so many around you would delight in your misstep or your sudden absence. A quiet tap at the door signals the arrival of your handmaidens. They enter in perfect silence, their linen robes whispering against the polished stone. The tallest carries a silver basin filled with Nile water and petals of blue lotus. The youngest, a fresh robe spun from linen so fine it is said to be fit for the goddess Hathor herself. Another bears the precious jars, oils of myrrh and cinnamon, sacred unguents meant to anoint the Queen and protect her from both harm and blemish. You are guided to the ceremonial bath, an alabaster pool inlaid with turquoise. The water is cold at first, a reminder that even divine skin must endure its earthly trials. Hands smooth and sure cleanse away the oils of the previous day, tracing each limb with practiced reverence. It is not a task performed for comfort, but for symbolism. To remain pure, to remain worthy in the eyes of the gods and of Egypt, one must be reborn with every sunrise. Once dried and wrapped in linen, you are seated before a low mirror of polished copper. Here the transformation begins. Coal is ground fresh, blended with malachite for its vivid green sheen. Not merely cosmetic, but protective, shielding the eyes from the sun's harsh glare and the ever-watchful gaze of rivals. Lips are tinted with ochre, cheeks with a subtle dusting of rouge. A queen must never appear fatigued, no matter the burdens she carries, or the sleepless nights spent listening for the scrape of sandals in the corridor. Then comes the hair, an elaborate ritual unto itself. Though your natural tresses are healthy, they are supplemented with strands of imported hair, woven skillfully to achieve the desired length and volume. Some strands may well have been clipped from the heads of foreign captives, a thought you wisely keep to yourself. As the final ornament, a broad collar of gold and faience is clasped about your neck. You glance at the figure in the mirror. Is this still you, beneath the layers of artifice? A fleeting thought. Queens do not indulge in such luxuries as self-reflection. By the time the temple bells toll the first hour, you're ready to face the day. Your appearance must suggest a woman untouched by mortal concerns, serene, gracious, above the petty dramas of court life. Of course, beneath this polished exterior lies a mind that cannot afford a moment's rest. You are not alone in the palace, not by a long measure. It is a world unto itself, a maze of columned halls and sun-dappled courtyards, vast enough to house an army of courtiers, scribes, priests, and artisans. Within these walls pulse the hidden currents of power and intrigue. Your chief rival may greet you with a smile at this morning's offering ceremony, a smile that does not reach her coal-darkened eyes. She too knows that every gesture, every glance is part of an unspoken game. To falter is to invite whispers. To stumble is to risk everything. The harem, though called such, is no mere den of idle pleasure. It is a complex political engine, its chambers echoing with the laughter of children who may one day rise to challenge the line of succession. Among the king's wives and favoured concubines, alliances are forged in secret, loyalties shift with the desert wind. The wise queen learns quickly to cultivate both friends and informants, and to trust neither. There are rituals to attend this morning. The Opet festival draws near, and preparations consume the palace. You will be expected to appear before the high priest of Amun, to offer rich garments and rare spices in the name of divine harmony. A minor ceremony, some might say, but one that offers a stage upon which influence is measured. The queen whose offerings gleam brightest, whose comportment seems most blessed, will find her star rising. And so you glide through the halls, trailing a faint scent of rose and cinnamon. The lesser wives bow low as you pass, their eyes carefully averted. Yet you feel the weight of their gazes upon your back the moment you move beyond sight. In the temple, beneath towering papyrus columns painted in vibrant hues, you kneel before the god's image. Priests chant in ancient tongues as you place your offerings upon the altar. Silks from Byblos, lapis from far-off Afghanistan, unguents crafted by the palace's finest perfumers. Every gift is a message, not only to the gods, but to those who watch from the shadows. As the ritual concludes, you catch the eye of one of the king's chief advisors. He inclines his head with a subtle smile, a gesture of deference, or a warning. One must always wonder. By midday, you are summoned to the Queen's council chamber, a rare privilege granted only to those of highest rank. Here you will hear reports from the palace stewards, matters concerning the granaries, the textile workshops, the progress of temple construction. Dry subjects perhaps, but each a thread in the greater tapestry of power. Your decisions must be swift, yet careful. Approve too many requests, and you risk appearing weak. Deny them all, and the whispers of tyranny will begin anew. You walk a careful line, each word weighed as though it were gold upon a scale. Among the day's matters is news from the workers' village near Deir el Medina. An illness has swept through the sculptor's quarter, delaying work upon your future tomb. A trivial concern to some, but you know better. The tomb is more than a resting place. It is your insurance against oblivion. The artisans will receive additional rations and amulets for protection. A wise investment. Afternoon brings a quieter respite, though never one entirely free of duty. You dine in a shaded loggia, a breeze stirring the embroidered silks that veil the arches. Servants present delicacies, honey cakes, roast duck, figs dripping with nectar. You eat sparingly, as is expected of one so elevated. A queen must never appear greedy. Indulgence is for the lesser sort. As you sip cool barley beer from a slender goblet, a trusted handmaiden kneels beside you with whispered news. A new consort has arrived from the northern provinces, young, beautiful, and gifted with a voice said to rival the songbirds of the Nile. Already she has caught the king's eye. You smile, a gesture as polished as the alabaster columns that surround you. And you begin to consider your next move. Later, beneath the shadow of the palace's western wing, you visit the royal nursery. The children greet you with wide eyes and eager laughter. Here, Among these innocent faces, the true future of Egypt stirs. You kneel to kiss the brow of your son, a prince yet too young to grasp the weight of the crown that may one day rest upon his head. You will teach him, in time, the art of ruling and surviving. Evening falls with a golden hush. The palace grows quieter, though within its stone heart the wheels of intrigue never cease their turning. You retreat to your private apartments, where oil lamps flicker against painted walls depicting lotus and papyrus, symbols of eternal life. There is yet one final duty, a private audience with the king. You are summoned to the inner chamber, where incense curls in lazy spirals beneath the gilded ceiling. The king greets you with the measured affection of a man who must divide his time among many. Your words are chosen with care, your gaze demure yet knowing. You are queen, but you are also counselor, diplomat, enchantress. The roles shift as swiftly as the Nile's current. When at last you return to your bedchamber, the moon rides high above the palace. You sit for a time beneath the open lattice work, watching its pale light shimmer upon the stone below. In this quiet hour, the trappings of queenship feel both distant and suffocating. For all the silks and jewels, all the deference and titles, the palace is a cage, one wrought not of iron, but of expectation and vigilance. A single misstep, a whispered rumour, and the queen may find herself cast from its heights to its darkest depths. Yet you are here. You remain. And tomorrow, as the bronze bells chime once more, you will rise again to meet the day's challenges with the grace and cunning that have brought you this far. For such is the life of a queen in ancient Egypt. A dance upon the blade's edge, cloaked in beauty and peril alike. There is a single truth in the palace, that all queens, whether newly crowned or silver-haired with experience, understand from the moment they first pass beneath its painted lintels. Your value lies not in your beauty, nor in your wisdom, nor even in the favour of the king. It lies in your womb. You are great royal wife, yes, but if you cannot produce an heir, and preferably a male heir, your days in these gilded halls may be numbered. No one says it aloud, of course. Court etiquette forbids such crassness. Instead, the expectation settles upon your shoulders like the heavy, broad collar you wear at every ceremony, a constant weight, at once ornamental and oppressive. Already the whispers have begun. You hear them between the polished pillars, where handmaidens exchange knowing glances. You see it in the eyes of the lesser wives and concubines, who watch your every step with thinly veiled anticipation. 1 month has passed since your coronation, then 2. The court astrologers mark the movements of the stars with increasing scrutiny, as if they might coax a royal conception from the heavens themselves. And so begins the most delicate and dangerous chapter of your queenship. It is no simple matter of nature taking its course. No, in Egypt, where the lines between the mortal and divine blur with every sunrise, even the act of producing an heir is shrouded in ritual and superstition. You are bathed in sacred waters drawn at dawn, infused with petals of lotus and fragments of lapis. Priests recite incantations over your garments, your bed, your very breath. Amulets are strung beneath your linen shift, the eye of Horus to guard against miscarriage, the Ankh for life, the frog-headed goddess Heket, midwife of the gods, to ensure safe delivery. Physicians, whose knowledge is equal parts herbal remedy and hopeful guesswork, prescribe strange concoctions, dates soaked in beer and honey, ground pomegranate mixed with frankincense. The occasional live fish, yes, live, pressed gently against the belly to divine the likelihood of conception. One must keep a straight face through such rituals. After all, queens are not afforded the luxury of skepticism. And the king? He too is aware of the stakes, though his attention is divided among many chambers, many women. Still, he dutifully appears when summoned, the union of king and queen being not merely a private affair, but a reenactment of cosmic creation itself. The priests say that in your embrace you embody Isis and Osiris, restoring the divine balance of the land. You try to think of this as you gaze up at painted stars on the ceiling, willing your body to cooperate. When at last the signs of pregnancy appear, a mist moon, a flutter in the belly, the court erupts in barely concealed relief. Musicians play in the courtyards, offerings are made at the temples. You are showered with gifts, fine linens, perfumed oils, and statuettes of Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, her toothy grin meant to ward off evil. But celebration soon gives way to caution, for childbirth, even in the palace, is fraught with peril. The annals of Egyptian history are replete with queens who entered the birthing chamber as goddesses and left it not at all. You are moved to special apartments near the temple of Hathor, patroness of motherhood and joy. Here, midwives attend you day and night, their weathered faces betraying both experience and unspoken concern. The floor is strewn with woven reeds and soft mats, the air thick with incense. One corner of the room is reserved for offerings, dates, honey, and the occasional small figurine of a crocodile, a nod to Sobek, whose protective ferocity is invoked at such times. You might wonder at this eclectic collection of guardians, but when faced with the shadow of death, one cannot be too selective in seeking allies. As the months progress, the court holds its breath. The Queen's pregnancy is no private matter. Every noble, every servant, every soldier watches for signs of progress and of danger. Should you miscarry, the blow to your standing would be immediate, perhaps irreversible. Such was the fate of many a royal wife. History whispers of queens quietly dismissed, their names stricken from records after a series of failed pregnancies. Others fared worse, poisoned by rivals eager to clear the path for their own offspring. One cannot overlook the tale of Queen Mutnejmet, wife of the usurper Horemheb, whose repeated miscarriages were immortalized in temple reliefs, and who vanished from a court soon after. Even a successful birth is no guarantee of lasting security, for if the child is female, the court's rejoicing will be muted, the king's gaze perhaps already drifting to younger, more promising consorts. Should the child be male, the stakes rise immeasurably. When your time comes, the palace enters a hush, broken only by the rhythmic chants of the midwives. You kneel upon birthing bricks, inscribed with spells of protection, gripping amulets so tightly that their impressions remain upon your palms long after. It is said that queens do not cry out, that they bear the ordeal with the stoic grace befitting a living goddess. In truth, the stone walls of your chamber have heard many royal screams, though none are recorded in the official annals. At last, a cry pierces the incense-laden air, not yours, but that of a newborn, a boy. The news spreads like wildfire through the palace. Bells ring out from Karnak. Priests light great fires upon the riverbanks. The Queen has borne a prince. The dynasty is secured for now. But this victory is tempered by reality. You know that even royal infants are not immune to the frailties of flesh. The child is swaddled in the finest linens, placed beneath protective amulets, and watched by wet nurses whose loyalty has been vetted 12 times over. A single misstep, a single drop of poison slipped into milk, and the triumph of today could become tomorrow's morning. You must be vigilant. Already factions within the palace shift and realign. The mother of the next in line is a powerful force, but also a target. One need only recall the fate of Queen Tia's daughter, murdered in infancy amid court intrigue, her name deliberately forgotten by the chroniclers. Even as you recover, your duties resume. You appear at public ceremonies, the infant prince cradled in your arms beneath a canopy of ostrich feathers. Statues are commissioned in your likeness, inscriptions proclaiming you mother of the god sun. Yet in the shadows, rival eyes glitter with envy. For queens in Egypt, there is no true rest. Having secured your position with an heir, you must now defend it with equal fervour. The harem buzzes with fresh schemes. The lesser wives whose sons must now vie for favour redouble their efforts. The old games resume, more dangerous than before. You attend council meetings with the king, your presence a subtle reminder of your new standing. You cultivate alliances among the priests and the nobility, ensuring that should calamity strike, as it so often does, you have the means to protect both yourself and your son. In private moments, you gaze upon the sleeping child with a mixture of fierce love and cold calculation. This tiny, squirming creature is your greatest triumph and your greatest liability. To raise a future pharaoh is to walk a perilous path, one where each tutor, each nursemaid must be scrutinised, each playmate considered a potential threat. And should the king take another great royal wife, not unheard of should you fall from favour, your task will become even harder. The court has long memories and short loyalties. One must never grow complacent. In time, if fortune favours you, your son will grow strong and wise. You will guide him through a labyrinth of palace politics, teaching him whom to trust and whom to watch with smiling suspicion. And if the gods are truly kind, you may one day witness him ascend the throne, the double crown resting upon his brow. But that day is far off. For now, you remain within the palace's painted cage, every breath a measured act of survival. You have borne an heir. The court's favour is yours. The songs of the priests praise your name. Yet beneath the gold and incense, the game has only just begun. For in Egypt, a queen's worth must be proved anew with each passing moon. To fade from the king's favour, to bear no further children, to falter in the ceaseless dance of courtly intrigue, is to risk the most chilling fate of all, erasure. And so, as the sun sets beyond the desert horizon, you cradle your son beneath the flickering light of oil lamps. You sing softly, an ancient lullaby older than the pyramids themselves. Yet your gaze is not fixed upon the sleeping child alone. It shifts, now and then, toward the shadows that gather at the chamber's edge. For a queen of Egypt, the night is never truly still, and the game is never truly over. The palace is vast. Towering stone colonnades stretch into cool shadowed corridors. Gardens bloom in neat geometric rows, where papyrus rustles in the breeze, and fountains murmur beneath the gaze of carved lions. Courtiers bow and drift past in linen and gold. From a distance, it looks serene, a world ordered and harmonious, as befits the heart of the greatest civilization on earth. Step a little closer though. Listen beyond the tinkling of harps and the solemn drone of priestly chants. There is another current running through this place, one not spoken of in the official inscriptions. The palace breathes intrigue, and within its breath it whispers one eternal truth. You are never alone. You are great royal wife, mother of a prince, and that makes you a prize target. Around you swirl the other women of the royal household, secondary wives, concubines, foreign princesses sent as diplomatic gifts, and their formidable retinues of ladies-in-waiting and ambitious relatives. Each one has a stake in the unspoken game, and many will not hesitate to play it boldly. There is no official map to this web of rivalries. You must learn its paths and pitfalls through experience, instinct, and trusted spies, though trust itself is a rare and fragile commodity. Even the servants who anoint your brow with sacred oils may carry news of your private moments to ears you'd rather not imagine. By custom, the king's harem occupies a separate quarter of the palace, a walled enclave of luxurious apartments, gardens and pavilions. Here, many of the royal wives and concubines reside when not summoned to court or to the king's side. In theory, it is a space of beauty and refinement. Music lessons, embroidery, poetry recitations beneath the shade of date palms. In practice, it is a simmering crucible of ambition. You walk the paths of these gardens with measured grace, always with attendants, of course. A queen is never seen wandering alone. That would invite gossip. And gossip here is more dangerous than any serpent lurking in the reeds. There are faces you greet with carefully polite words, eyes you meet with a bland smile that conceals your watchfulness. You know the histories. Nefertari, beloved queen of Ramses the Great, ruled the harem like a goddess in flesh. Yet even she faced the unending rivalry of Isetnofret, a secondary wife whose own son would eventually inherit the throne. The two women vied not only for the king's affection, but for the shaping of Egypt's future. Their courtiers manoeuvred behind silken screens. Their allies whispered in temple halls. At Nefertari's death, her tomb was vandalized. Whether by jealous rivals or the cold hand of courtly politics, none can say. What remains today is both splendid and wounded. You think of such stories often now. They serve as both warning and inspiration. Each new arrival to the palace, each young concubine with eyes like polished obsidian, each foreign princess with her father's promises and her mother's cunning is a potential threat. The king's heart is easily turned, as history has shown time and again. Queens have been set aside for less than a careless glance at the wrong banquet. Even sisters are not immune to this game. Consider Cleopatra the Seventh, the last and most famous of Egypt's queens. In a world no less treacherous than yours, she eliminated her own siblings to secure the throne. Her brother husband Ptolemy the 13th was drowned in the Nile after their bitter civil war. Her younger sister Arsinoe was paraded through Rome and later executed at Cleopatra's request. It is a grim reminder that in matters of power, blood offers little protection. You take tea today in one of the palace's shaded gardens, the sandstone walls hung with woven garlands. A small gathering of royal women has been arranged, ostensibly to celebrate the upcoming Opet festival. In reality, it is a subtle test of alliances. The Queen's tea, like all things here, carries its risks. The palace kitchens are well guarded, the chief cupbearer loyal to you, or so he says. Yet poison need not be crude to be effective. A tincture that clouds the mind, a powder that weakens resolve, a slow-acting venom masked by sweet honeyed dates. You sip carefully, smile lightly. The cup never leaves your sight. Conversations drift around you. A young concubine boasts of her skill with the harp. Another praises the king's latest hunting exploits. All harmless on the surface. But beneath the words flow subtle currents of status and intent. Every compliment is a probe, every glance a calculation. One of the lesser wives leans forward, her eyes gleaming. "Your son grows strong, my queen. I hear he bested his tutor in wrestling last week." A harmless comment, or a veiled threat. To draw attention to your son is to draw attention to the ambitions that circle him like vultures. "He is a child," you reply smoothly. "He enjoys his games." You shift the topic with practiced ease, asking after the health of her daughter. To accept flattery is dangerous. To appear defensive, fatal. Such exchanges are endless, their stakes invisible to the casual observer. Many queens of old failed to master them and paid dearly. Queen Ankhesenamun, widow of Tutankhamun, sought alliance with a foreign prince to secure her safety. A bold move that ended with her vanishing from the record. Was she betrayed by a rival? Silenced by the priests? No one knows. Even now, you must wonder which smiles around you conceal knives. The old adage holds true. A quiet tea in the garden can be more dangerous than a battlefield. Your allies are few and must be cultivated with care. A trusted lady-in-waiting whose family owes you loyalty. A eunuch whose discretion has been purchased with gold and promises. A priestess whose whispered prayers carry double meanings. You build your network slowly, patiently, for haste invites exposure. Yet alliances shift. Friendships sour. Today's confidant may be tomorrow's betrayer. The palace records are rich with such cautionary tales. In quieter moments, you walk among the statues of past queens. Their faces, serene in alabaster or painted with fading pigments, offer no counsel. Yet their stories linger. You think of Tie, wife of Amenhotep III, who wielded immense influence and corresponded with foreign kings, yet whose legacy was nearly eclipsed by the rise of Akhenaten and his religious upheaval. You think of Hatshepsut, who dared to rule as king, donning the false beard of Pharaoh. For years she outmaneuvered her rivals, until her memory was almost entirely erased by the jealous Thutmose III. Such are the lessons you must heed. Power is never given freely. It is seized, defended, and, if one is wise, relinquished only at death. As evening falls, the gathering disperses. Courtiers retreat to their quarters. Musicians pack away their lyres. You linger a moment beneath the stars, the scent of jasmine thick in the air. A new note arrives by the hand of a trusted servant, unsigned of